Anna Perrin, under-the-radar superstar. So Joanna's narrated a crazy number of books and coached hundreds, but is often underrated, and I think most of that's because she has a very famous husband in this business, and I won't mention his name right now. So I saw her at the New England Narrators Retreat, and I didn't really know who she was, although I knew who her husband was at that point. And I was just blown away when she was in the workshops working with people, how quickly she helped them go from being an okay performer to being dramatically better in a short period of time. She connects with people, she makes them feel comfortable, and she helps them be much, much, much better in this business in such a short period of time. It's really crazy. So we had a joy talking to her, but she's absolutely underrated, not well enough known, but she's a real gem in this business. Enjoy this conversation with Anna Perrin.
All right, Joanna, welcome to Audio Barnyard. We're really happy to have you here. And I just want to start briefly, and I know it can be hard to condense a life story into a few minutes, but you've narrated over 150 audiobooks at this point, and counting, of course. How did you first come to narration? Because I know you've done acting and film and theater and photography. So how did you roll all of those things into narration?
Well, it was indirectly because I used to doctor and write children's scripts. And we did a series, or I did a series over Easter that was supposed to be non-denominational, kind of. So it had the Easter Bunny, and it didn't really talk about Easter. And in that, we had 30 scripts, one for each day, that was going to be used as a giveaway on television. And so we had to make up these voices of all these characters I created. So we had a cast of about 10 of us, and there were about 15 animal characters, and we started doing that. And it became afterwards a comic book that the kids could get online. So that was my first actual book. And then I got into doing some comics for a company where we did the Spider-Man series. So that's how I sort of got into. Do we have somebody pop in? That was how I sort of got into doing narration. So it was indirectly through my children's work, my children's writing work. And then eventually I got into audiobooks.
Well, so I want to go back in your backstory. I was reading in your bio that your parents were street performing gypsies and you were orphaned really young. And so you being the oldest, was doing the nightly shows to feed your siblings.
This is supposed to be secret. Yeah.
Oh, okay. No. So when did you make the transition? So if you go back before you were doing the audiobooks, you have a pretty strong theater background, if I remember. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes. I was doing a lot of off Broadway and original works. And at my college, we would do, they had an extra room. So we co-opted it and turned it into a theater. So we did a lot of sort of regional productions, from non-union regional productions from campus. But yeah, it was mostly theater. And then I sort of fell into TV with soap operas. I did a lot of soap opera work. And from there, I did some film work. And and I did commercial work. I was a commercial voiceover person, and I did some documentaries and stuff like that. So audiobooks were kind of the last bastion. And I didn't know that much about it. I mean, I thought it was incredibly wonderful when we got to do comics. I had no idea you could do entire books. So I guess I started doing audiobooks themselves around 2008. So it's been a while. But it was a field I only really knew about through mostly Johnny, through my husband, because he was pretty big even at that time in audiobooks. And I started doing some work through recorded books for proofing and stuff like that. So I wasn't actually in the recording part. I was in the technical part. But anyway, all that sort of came together, and eventually I got into audiobooks as a narrator.
Yeah,
no gypsies, as far as I remember. But.
No gypsies. You are, of course, married to Johnny Heller, who is another extremely well-known audiobook narrator. We weren't going to lead with that because you've had an amazing career in your own right and of your own volition. But did he sort of push you to try audiobooks after you'd done so much other voiceover and narration work? Did he encourage that?
He didn't, yes and no. I mean, he didn't try to push me into it, but he kept saying, oh, you should, like everybody says, if they like your voice, you should do audiobooks, like it's so simple. So he said, you should try it. But he indirectly did become involved because I started getting private contracts for universities. And it was because Johnny was working for someone who was working for universities, getting people to come in and do textbooks or books that the professors had written and they were part of their curriculum. And they sent him one book that he said, well, this really needs a woman to narrate it. This is not from a man's viewpoint. And so they said, do you know anybody? And so he said, well, as a matter of fact. So I had to audition. I did a really quick audition thinking, oh, these people are never going to hire me. And I mean, seriously, I'd never read anything. I did comic books. These were, intelligent professorial books. And so anyway, I did this audition. And within an hour, they emailed me back and said, you've got it. And I was like, okay. So it was really kind of baptism by fire. I didn't know anything. I didn't know. I mean, I knew how to prep a book. I prepped it like a script, but I didn't really understand all the points that go into narrating a nonfiction, especially very intelligently written nonfiction. So, it was kind of a baptism by fire. But after that, I started working a lot for University Press. So it kind of mushroomed out. And I did get involved with publishers, not directly through Johnny, but they were publishers who knew Johnny and then heard I had done University Press and then said, hey, do you want to do this nonfiction kind of thing? So I guess indirectly, it wasn't like, he said to people, you have to hire her. But he, the initial one was because it was a book that was sent to him that he could just not record because he wasn't female. So
I want to ask about your acting background. Do you think that helped so that you could walk in and do your first book at a level? I mean, I don't have an acting background. I don't think I could do that. Do you think, how did that affect your startup?
I think it helps a lot because you're used to, like I said, I don't think of an audiobook as a book. I think of it as a script. So I work it like it's a script. I highlight the way I would if it was a script. If it's nonfiction, my rule of thumb is my role is the author. I inhabit that author and I have to give their truth. So I do approach it like it's an acting job. And it did help. It helps a lot. Especially, I think what helped me the most was I studied a lot of cold reading techniques because when you do commercials or even TV would cast, they'd cast you on Monday and you had to be on the set on Thursday. And so they don't have time to kind of pussyfoot around. So they will just hand you a script of, 2 pages and you have no idea what's going on. So you have to come up with an entire background for why you're saying these things and what's going on, even if it's not the right one, because you don't know what the script involves. And so cold reading kind of helps you think on your feet. And I found it helped me a lot with audiobooks. So
yeah, and
I would say, yes, acting background helps a lot.
yeah, and I know you've done a lot of photography too. Two very different mediums, photography and narration or audiobooks, but a lot of times things interplay in ways that we don't even think about. So I'm curious if there are ways that your photography work informs the way that you narrate a book, or maybe the way you try to set a scene in a book, for example.
So I think, yeah, it probably does color the way, because I envision everything. Like, for instance, I envision audiobooks cinematically often. I see them as a film. So when I'm seeing them as a film, I'm kind of the cinematographer. So I kind of set the shot up in my head. So I guess I never thought about it, but they do actually kind of influence each other. That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I asked because my wife's also a photographer, and she's talked about how sometimes when you're photographing subjects, you can't necessarily wait for everything to be perfect. You can try to set things up as best you can, but you only have a narrow window of time. So sometimes you just have to go and snap a bunch of pictures and then figure out what's good or what's the best later.
Right.
So I don't know.
Right.
Sometimes maybe, I don't know if that helps narrating because maybe it helps you not overthink things so much. I don't know. That's just something that struck me as a possibility.
Huh. I guess it's also, yeah, because sometimes when you're narrating, even if you prep the book, even in fiction, especially in fiction, a character takes you in a different direction than you expected. Like you come up with how this character sounds in your head and you're doing the character and you realize that the character is now involved into somebody else while you're narrating, which is also part of, I think, that cold reading or even that photography thing of setting up a scene. You can only, sometimes you just have to shoot. Yes.
Well, I have a question. So if you're doing, what do you recommend for somebody that's new? Like, I don't think I could do a cold reading because I'm not sure I could. Is that something that if I'm new, you're going to recommend that I practice? How do I even get started with that? How do I practice it? Is it
With
something
cold
important for
reading?
audiobooks?
Well, when I coach, part of my coaching thing is I teach people as if acting is important to their narration, because I think it is. So I
Cool.
often start out with people who have had no acting background. In fact, I often help a lot of authors. So they don't have an acting background. And I try to lead them with minimal acting technique. What's a beat, what's a scene, what makes up a scene, why the beat's important, how it propels the through line. And so cold reading, no, I don't think cold reading itself is important to someone who's not had no acting training. But it's a good sense to hone because it helps you think on your feet. So sometimes with certain people, I have talked about cold reading techniques, especially if they do a lot of nonfiction. Because sometimes when you're prepping, if you have a really tight deadline, you can only prep half the book and then you have to start. And then you have to go back and prep the other half. So you have to be able to quickly discern a point of view of what the author wants and use that point of view, which is a lot of what's used in cold reading technique. The point is to pick a point, to pick something you can work with, to pick a direction. And so, yeah, it does help. But mostly I do teach acting techniques. So kind of when you coach with me, you get a mini acting class.
I'm curious about what you've learned about teaching acting over the years, especially to audiobook or voiceover students, because this applies not just to audiobooks, but even if you're doing a commercial or a short form explainer video, sometimes you still have to try to inhabit that script as best you can to give the best read you can. What have you learned about teaching people who don't have an acting background, who want to get into voiceover or audiobooks or both? What have you learned about trying to teach people who don't, they haven't studied the Meisner method or these very
Right.
intense, intricate acting techniques that can take months and years to master? How do you teach that
Yeah.
from the ground up?
Well, because I only talk in little bits of actor speak or, like I said, beats, scenes, script, I don't inundate anybody. I usually give them parables, if that helps, of, when you see this film and you get this concept and I demonstrate it, I kind of lead them holding their hand if they haven't had any acting training. But I do incorporate acting philosophy, recall, imaging, painting a scene in your head before you speak it. And believe it or not, even someone who hasn't had any acting training can relate to these as long as they're small bites. It isn't, I'm not going to give you the Meisner technique. I'm not going to study Stanislavski with anybody. But, if I give people small bites, almost everyone understands if I say, picture your favorite spot. Picture that in your head. Well, you can see the trees if it's a bench. If you have a view, you can see the water or, whatever. And we all can do that. Children do it. Children do it. That's part of their nature. But as we grow up, we forget how to do it. So I basically just ask people to tap back into being that child, to go back and what did the day smell like? Who'd you see? What did you hear? And it sounds to some people, it may sound a little like do out there, but it isn't. You'd be surprised once people start doing that and they can read the same passage. Once they put those images in their head, even they hear the difference in their read. And I think that's part of why they come back to me. Because they can hear it. They can see that something they thought was, oh, this is just silly. I'm picturing myself in a park and I smell somebody selling hot dogs over there. But then they do their read and they realize they've infused the read with it and it sounds more natural. And they surprise themselves. So yeah, anybody can be taught kind of any basic acting. We can't all be, De Niro or somebody or Meryl Streep, but we can all kind of incorporate those little beats into our lives and understand them.
That's great. I love that.
You mentioned beats all the time. Can you explain that for somebody who hasn't even heard that term, and how does it apply?
Well, for instance, in an audiobook, I always say if you take a paragraph of nonfiction, almost always you can read part of the first sentence and read the last sentence, and it'll make a complete thought, even without the middle. And it's because the first sentence was a beat. and you took a pause, and then you said your yada, 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 and this is why black is black and white is white, which is the end of the sentence. So beats make up a scene. Several beats can make up a scene. If you were in theater, my first beat would be, I open the door, I walk in, and I say, you called? And then my second beat might be, I wanted to talk to you about this. Well, that's another beat. So little by little, you put all those beats together, and at the end of it, you will have a complete scene. And it works that way in audiobooks too. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very good. It's nice to hear. I mean, I'm clueless in explaining it that way. It's great to hear your point of view and how you're explaining it to people, and that makes it easy to visualize. And I can see where that would be very helpful for a lot of people.
Well,
and how did you come up with? This is something that's kind of traditional in the acting world, that this is how they think of it, express it?
Oh, you mean
and
in
that was your
beats
genesis for that?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
the most basic when you're studying acting are to understand your beats and how the beats propel the scene forward. So in other words, you always hear jokes about it where somebody says, what's my motivation? Just to sit just sit. That's your motivation. But it's those beats that give you the motivation to carry off the scene. So the beats all multiply into a scene, the scenes all multiply into acts, and eventually you've got a 3-act play, or if you're a Shakespeare, a 5-act play, or whatever. So I think it's just basic, techniques of acting that aren't difficult for anybody to understand. For my degree at one point, I had to teach children theater, and I thought, what do I teach? How do you teach children? But you'd be surprised, even these small kids, 5 and 6 years old, could understand the idea of beat. You know what I mean? They just instinctively would put it in when they were doing little theater pieces. So it just seems to be something we all kind of pick up easily, whether you're a trained actor or not.
Yeah, that sounds like it would have been a fascinating challenge. Maybe a little daunting at first. How do I take all this lifetime of learning and try to teach it to 5, 6, and 7-year-olds?
Yes.
Did that make you a better actor?
I think it did, because it got me back in touch with what I said earlier, being that kid. Because when we're kids, we don't judge ourselves. We just go up there and do whatever we have to do. And we don't think, oh, I look stupid doing this, or I sound like an idiot doing this. We just do it. And these kids were an abject lesson in that. They just had no qualms about getting up there and doing anything. You know what I mean? And so it kind of reminded me that that's what you need to be a good actor. You need to be able to tap into that little kid when you have to, and not worry so much about who's going to like it, who's not going to like it. I mean, for instance, if you're doing an audiobook and all you're going to think is, oh, I'm going to get reviewed, I'm going to get slammed on this book, you're not going to be able to do a good job. Don't worry about it. If you get slammed, you get slammed. If they think you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, wonderful for you. Just keep narrating and doing what you do.
Dealing with bad reviews is something every actor has to deal with in every medium, no matter how great and accomplished and star-studded they may be. So I would imagine in the 150 plus audiobooks that you've narrated, you've probably gotten a couple of negative reviews, even though the vast majority are glowing.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time you got a bad review and how you've learned to deal with that kind of thing over the years?
Well, I have to say, and this is going to sound funny, I've gotten worse reviews for narration than I ever got when I was doing theater. But I will say it's because now everybody has a podium. Now, even if you're a Broadway actor, you go to a Broadway show, before you had to wait for the New York Times or the New Yorker or somebody to let the review out. Now a show is in previews and you'll read and everybody's got an opinion. Best thing I've ever seen on Broadway. Oh my God, the worst thing I've ever seen on Broadway. I kind of operate from, I know the bad reviews are out there, but I don't pay attention to them. I try not to pay attention to them. Obviously, we all have egos, because for the same reason, if I'm going to believe all the negative reviews, then can I believe all the positive reviews? On the other hand, if I believe all the positive reviews, can I negate the negative reviews? So I always kind of figure, you know what? It's all a crapshoot. It all depends on who was listening on what day. If, you remind them of their mother who they love or their girlfriend who they hate. So I kind of try to incorporate all that. And I always tell people, I don't bother. I don't look up reviews half the time. So the few times something really big happened. Someone else had to tell me. Because I think if you depend too much on what other people are thinking, it'll also stop you. It'll stop. Well, I must be really great because this person thinks I'm wonderful, or I must be really awful because this person thinks I'm awful. And so I try not to dwell on any of them, good or bad. I believe or disbelieve both equally. Let's put it that way.
So who should we listen to then? So I'm gonna minimize my reviews as far as impact on me, but who should I listen to? Maybe
listen to publishers. If publishers keep hiring you and authors keep asking for you and you keep auditioning and getting the books, that's all you need to know. Because most times, these aren't, a lot of people aren't professional reviewers, but they have a blog, or they're not professional reviewers, but they work for somebody who reviews and has a review platform. So, really it's kind of, has this person learned critique? Do they really know? In other words, it's still just that person's it's valid because it's their opinion. I mean, obviously, if you do look at reviews and the same thing keeps happening, he keeps hissing his S's. He keeps hissing his S's. Well, then you might go, okay, do I have some kind of impediment where I'm hissing my S's and it's invading the book for someone who's listening? So if the same thing comes up, I could see where, you might take it as a lesson. But when I used to look at my reviews, I found none of them made sense most of the time. I don't like her. I don't like her. She sounds too smart. Well, I was reading a book by a professor, and I'm thinking, well, wasn't me. It was the professor who wrote the book. So, if it's something valid, I say take it with you. But if it's just somebody in the dark typing away going, I had a bad day, so I'm going to take it out on you, I don't try to pay attention to it. No. I think your work speaks more than the reviewers, because it's eclectic. It's just a person's opinion.
My wife, who is also a college professor, will be extremely triggered at hearing people say that your reviewers say that you sounded too smart on a book. That's unbelievable. But
Yes.
It's the kind of thing that narrators and, frankly, especially women have to deal with, right?
Well, that's true. And I always say I can get away with saying it because I'm a woman. I mean, if you said it, someone would go, but it is tougher for women in audiobooks, especially with nonfiction, because, I've heard some lovely nonfiction by women where I've really engaged listening, but you'll read the reviews and someone will say, I don't like the sound of her voice. She sounds too high pitched. She sounds too low pitched. There's a lot of things where they talk about your sound of your voice. Whereas if you go to books for men, they may not like the book, or they may not like some of the tenets, but they generally never, ever say anything about the man's voice. His voice doesn't get judged. Women get judged all the time for their voice. As we can see, going back to politics, everybody couldn't stand Hillary Clinton. They thought she had a horrible voice. She didn't bother me, but she bothered a lot of people. So, women are always judged more for their vocal quality than men are. So it's a little bit tougher. So if your wife's a professor, I'm sure she goes through stuff like that all the time.
Yeah. And when you're coaching women specifically, do you have to have this talk with them about how they're going to be judged, sometimes more harshly or in different ways than men might?
I do. And what I usually just tell women, because it was something I learned the hard way, which is no matter what the topic, no matter how you're reading it, always try to let warmth come through. Because a lot of what's judged is if a woman doesn't sound like she has some kind of a warmth coming out of her voice, that's when you get the remarks that the voice is to this, to that, to the other thing. So I generally try to coach them to try to keep warmth in their voice, or to find places in what they're reading, if it's not funny and there's no humor, to find some humor, so that whoever's listening to you knows you're human. So they don't say, is this a computer reading this book? So that your human qualities come out. And I usually instruct women to do that more than I do with men, because I know they're going to be more judged for their voice quality. So.
Could you say something with no warmth and something with warmth?
To demonstrate it? No, but I can show you a trick, which is if you're reading something that's really, intense, with a lot of things that have to be grasped, a scientific journal or something like that, I always just tell people at some point to narrate through a smile. Because if you narrate through a smile, your voice lifts up and it sounds warmer. See, like I'm talking to you. Don't I sound a little bit warmer now that I'm smiling?
Well, you've heard that thing where they say the director said, could you do that again with more smile?
Yeah.
And sometimes they do it and that works, and sometimes they don't. But it really is something you can hear. I suspect somebody like you hears it all day long, whether I'm smiling or not when I'm performing. I don't know. I'm hoping it comes through to the other
Right.
people, but I know there's a big difference if that's my thought process and that's where I'm starting with and that's what I feel like. And if I'm excited, it should come through in my voice. And one thing that I'm kind of weirded out about is I've recorded a bunch of dual voice things with my wife, and she'll say, "Can you like sound more enthusiastic?" And I'm thinking, and she's saying the same thing that doing this whole thing. I thought I was big enough. Then I hear the playback later, and I realize, oh, she's right. I'm playing it all way too small. Do you feel you need to do you play things up way more than you might on
Um,
stage, or less, or is it where
I
does it
think for
fall in?
audiobooks, you have to play it a little less. Like I know that some of the hardest coaching I have to do are for people who are theater trained and have great projection, not because they don't get
Mm-hmm.
the acting style involved in audiobooks, but because they don't get the mic technique. That if you flick an eyelash on some of these mics, you can hear the and so people who have had stage training have this projection and they're on top of the mic, that they're blowing you away. They're so loud. So that's a thing that I find it's hard to get people to understand, that you have to. So, because less is more, I guess is what I'm saying. Like they say with film, less is more with audiobooks. You can't, not maybe in a commercial because you've got 30 seconds to grab attention, but in a consistent audiobook, you can't be up here the entire time. There have to be fluctuations, there have to be hills and valleys. So no, I don't, I try to not go over the top. I try to keep it lower, because it's going to sound more so when someone's just listening, because they don't have your face. They just have your voice in their ears. And so anything that's too over the top or too loud or too anything will immediately take a listener out of the book. And once they do that, you don't know if you're going to get them back. I mean, I once got taken out of a book after 6 hours for one little thing, and it was the narrator's choice. Could have been the right choice, but it wasn't for me. And after 6 hours of listening, I just stopped the book. I couldn't listen. And I'm not usually that harsh. I've never walked out in a film. I've never walked out in a theater. I figure if you're doing it, I'm listening, I'm watching. But it just took me so out of it, I had to stop the book. So you want to avoid that. You don't want to isolate the listener. So less is always more when you're doing an audiobook, I think.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. It's interesting. Now, if somebody's brand new and they're coming in and they're wondering, well, what should I be doing? What are the top 3 things that I should be considering if they were starting today? What should they kind of think about? Where should they start? Should I just go ahead and read the phone book every day? What do you
I would
suggest?
suggest that if just because you think you have a nice voice doesn't mean you can necessarily do audiobooks, just like you can't necessarily do commercials or documentaries or anything else. Sometimes the funkiest voices sound better for a lot of things, including commercials and documentaries. So I would say, if you're starting out, but you're not sure if this is for you, I would get a decent mic and start recording myself, because the first thing you're going to have to learn is stamina. It takes a lot of stamina to do an audiobook. It's not just the prepping and reading the book and making notes, and if it's nonfiction, looking things up. It's being able to sit in front of a mic for hours at a time talking. What it does to your voice, what it does to the quality of your voice, how often you start making mistakes, how often before you run out of breath and you hear large in between words. So I would say if you're even thinking about this, pick up something you enjoy reading and just try to read for half an hour, 45 minutes without stopping, and then listen back to yourself and see how your voice sounds. If you can do this and you feel like, oh yeah, I can do this, I would always suggest coaching, at least initially, or going to a workshop, or somewhere where you can meet other people who do it for a living, or who are also like you, but at varying stages. Maybe they're brand new, maybe they've got 10 books, maybe they have 40 books, just so you can see what other people are going through. And also to have those people maybe help evaluate where you fall by listening to you do a read, or seeing if you can take direction or, that's the only way to find out if it's something you really want to do. And the third thing, I think, but not a lot of people aren't going to do this, is maybe take an improv class or take a quick acting class to learn some basic ideas about acting, or to be able to stand in front of people and speak. Because even though if you're in a booth, it's private, you also have times when you may be called into a studio and it's not private. You might have a director and an engineer. So you have to learn to be able to do that in front of people without, choking, without clamming up. So I guess those would be my things, try practicing for stamina, try taking workshops or even online workshops. They don't have to be expensive. I mean, even just checking out, making friends with other narrators on any of the sites on Facebook. And study some acting, read a book about acting, or like I said, take some informal classes. The YMCA has classes. A lot of colleges have free classes. You don't have to spend a fortune on it. And the same thing with equipment. If you're not sure you're going to be doing books, don't buy a whisper booth. Don't buy a studio brick booth. Don't, get expensive mics. See if there's, if there's a ability in them Thar Hills before you start spending money. So I say do
And
your
when
research.
it comes to producing your audiobook, to the technical aspects of it, recording, editing, processing, how has that evolved for you over the years? What are some things you've learned there?
Well, to be honest, I kind of lucked out because since I always dealt with professional publishers and, I never had to worry about learning anything. And I always would send in raw. You're laughing because you set up my Studio One up there, Don. But I just would send it to the publishers. The publishers have proofers. They go through the proofing. They send me the pickups. I do the pickups. They do all that. But what I did have to learn was originally Pro Tools, how to work Pro Tools in my studio. And then when Pro Tools wasn't working for me anymore, now I've switched to Studio One. But I've learned a couple of cheats. Let's say I've learned more when I did Pro Tools. I could finesse a little bit video. It's still raw audio, but I would learn how to take out a hiccup or a loud noise and stuff like that. And I'm sure it would take me, what would take me 3 minutes, somebody who knew what they were doing could do in 10 seconds. But I learned little cheats like that. But I have to say I was lucky enough that because I always dealt with publishers, I didn't have to learn mastering and I did proofing, like I said, in my past, but you can never proof yourself because for one thing, you don't know if you're pronouncing a word wrong if you think it's the right way to pronounce it. There's an old story about a star, and I won't say who he was, that he was recording a book and the word was sabotage. And so he said, we were sabotaged. And so they stopped him and said, no, it's sabotage. And he said, when I say it, it's sabotage. And so they left it in. But the point is, had he been proofing his own work, he would never sabotage. Sabotage, that's correct, isn't it? So you can't really proof your own work. So I haven't really learned that much about editing because I haven't had to. But I really feel badly for a lot of people who started on ACX because they had to really learn how to hit the ground running. They had to learn how to proof correctly or hire a proofer. They had to learn how to master or hire a person to master. And luckily for me, I just didn't have to. The biggest thing for me was learning to self-direct, because when I did the books for the university press by myself, I got to hire a director, engineer, and a booth. So I didn't work from home. And I always had an ear listening and doing all the grunt work for me. So for me, learning to self-direct was the biggest thing. And I'm still not really great. I'd have to say, I can direct you or you. I can hear when something doesn't ring true, like a student when they're not quite into the piece, or if I'm listening. It's easy for me to direct somebody else. It's much harder to direct myself because there's a lot of second guessing that goes into it. So.
But wouldn't that be the same? So that's why star athletes have coaches, musicians, some of the best musicians in the world have producers, and having an outside point of view is insanely helpful, although most of us in this business are self-directing. And so that is an art that over time, we need to get
Yeah.
better at, even if we don't start off being great. Because so how do you get over this second guessing yourself? How do you?
Well, I've gotten better at it. I used to go back a lot. I would do a take and then I'd think, "Does that sound right?" And then I'd listen again and I go, "I can do that better." But I'd always save the original one, because I do remember an engineer telling me once, he said, "You know, when people do 3 and 4 and 5 takes of the same thing?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I always find the first take was the best, because the first take was their gut and what they originally felt. And then they started to think it through, and they redid it. And keeping that in mind, I will sometimes go back and redo something, but I always keep a copy of the original. And then later I'll go back and listen, and 9 times out of 10, the original take was absolutely fine. I was hyperventilating for no reason. So that's helped me not go back as often. Also, by using earbuds instead of a really wonderful, expensive headset, because I can leave one out and just keep one in my ear so I can just basically hear. So I don't focus on how I interpreted the line, but just to see where I am to pick up the next sentence. So it takes me away from judging myself, because I can hear myself, but I can't hear myself so loudly that I go, oh, wait a minute. That didn't sound true when she said it that way. You know what I mean? I just hear what I said and I go on to the next beat. So those are just little tricks. But in the beginning, I used to go back a lot. I was probably earning 5
You're
cents an
very
hour.
normal about that.
Very what?
Yeah, you're very normal about that, though. I deal with I used to edit for a bunch of these high profile people, and I'd think your first take, not only, is better because I don't know, it had the right feel, but also it flowed nicely with what was before it. And sometimes I would find this weird thing where the second take, maybe one word of it was actually, quote, nicer or
Right.
cleaner or whatever, but it didn't fit
Yeah.
as well with what came before it. So you got what you were talking about earlier, being out of the
Yep.
story because something didn't feel right and didn't match.
And sometimes you can hear that. So you
Go
can
ahead.
hear that sometimes in an audio.
Yes.
You can, I've listened to bits of mine because I want to put a, piece as a demo. Let's say I like this particular book. So I'll go through, because normally I don't listen to my own books, but, but I will take something that I want for a demo, and, I'll be listening and I'll know exactly where I did a punch and roll, because I'll hear it. It didn't quite, it was there. Now, maybe somebody else might not have noticed who was listening, but because I know my own vocal sounds, I know, oh, that was a punch and roll. That didn't match exactly.
Well, it is an art, and some people over time get better and better at it. Most
Yeah.
do. And, so when you're now, as you're looking forward, how would you advise somebody in their world that should they be doing 6 takes and picking the best one? How do they practice and get it back down to where they're essentially owning their performance?
I think the only thing that you can tell them that will finally sink in is once they start doing more than 1 or 2 books. Once they start doing books more consistently, especially when you've got a deadline looming and you might have 2 books due on the same deadline, you start to realize you've got to let go. There's good and there's good enough. And you have to get to a point where you kind of go, this is good enough. This is not as important as this. This has to be fine, but this is okay. And I think you only get that from working a lot, that you start to realize you don't have the luxury to give in to your own vanity, because that's all it is. It's kind of like, I know I can do that scene better. Well, maybe you can, but is it okay the way it is? And does it work with the rest of the book? And is this book due tomorrow? I think you gotta move on. So you have to forgive yourself, and you have to learn to stop judging yourself as harshly, I guess, which kind of goes into what everybody's talking about now. What is it? Imposter syndrome. Everybody is talking about these days. Don't give in to that. If you're doing the audiobook, you're good enough. Believe me, you're good enough. So just do the book and get out of yourself. If you're still listening too much to your takes, then you're not into the book.
Well, and as we wrap up, Joanna, I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the sign behind you, which I know is your husband's. But why does he hang the sign there? Why does he remind himself and his and your students of this this very eloquent mantra?
Well, that's generally the first lesson of every new narrator, everybody wants to get through because they're nervous and they speak too fast. And you have to slow the down. And so what happened was a student of his made this for him because that was always his thing. And people would quote it. Well, you know what Johnny says, slow the F down, you know. And so he put it up there one day, I think because the student was in on a workshop and she had given it to him. But then everybody commented on it, and everybody always comments on it, so we decided to leave it up. In fact, I was going to ask you if you wanted me to take it down before we started. But it's the most important thing to learn, believe it or not, is to take a breath and slow down, or slow the F down.
You can use it with it however much embellishment you would like. Yes. Well, Joanna, this has been so great. Exactly. We really appreciate your wisdom, your insight, and for sharing that with us and taking time with us today. And we should.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
Oh, good. And let people know where they can find you online, and if they want coaching, if they want to learn more from you, where they can do that.
Okay. Well, I have a website, joannaperrin.com, that has basically demos and a little info about me. And there's a little tab on the top that has coaching, and it just explains what I feel my coaching involves and how to pay me and where to locate me and stuff like that. So they can just go to my website. And that's it. Or on Facebook. I'm on Facebook, and also on Instagram, and I'm on Twitter. So I'm kind of all over the place.
And everybody should know, at least once a year, Joanne just does workshops all over the country at different times of the year. But once a year, there's a New England Narrators Retreat. And one of the things the reason you're on today, I knew about you. And then I go to this retreat, and I was coach as well. And I'm going, damn, is she good? and kind of one of the things that I thought about was, she's so good. And because I knew you were associated with Johnny, I didn't know if it was you were, like, oh, maybe it's just because she's related to him that she's here or something like that. Because I didn't know. And I do think right now, unfortunately, in the beginning, until they know, they go, well, I don't know, but once they find out, and I saw you in some of the workshops and people were making such killer progress with you helping them and your comments and your insights that you provided, I thought, okay, we need to make sure more people know about Joanna because even if you never knew Johnny, and I know that you guys collaborate, and the one thing that does happen, you guys have this vicious cycle that's the positive that everybody in the industry needs. You actually have a sounding board, and he has a sounding board, and I'm sure sometimes he's smart enough, maybe not in public, okay, but in private to get that feedback from somebody you trust, who will give it to you. And that's where a good coach, you have a built-in great coach if you ever wanted, and say, hey, how is this? And he has somebody to bounce things off of as well. And you guys are absolutely smart enough to hang around with some of the best narrators in the business. And so you get to see what they're doing. So that retreat, by the way, I'll just tell you, I don't make a dime on getting more people there, but it's an experience like no other because everybody there has invested, because unfortunately with flights these days and hotels and all the other things involved with going and being in that kind of group, it's somewhat life-changing because you realize, wow, this many people are willing to invest that much in time, effort, and money to go hang out. And not only are the sessions themselves with people like you amazing, afterward, you get a chance to hang out at lunch or dinner, and then you get to talk about the little things that maybe you didn't want to disclose in public, and you wanted to ask you a question, and you've always been so gracious with so many people about helping them get better at the craft without acting like you're, quote, better. You had the right, because of what you've done, to act like you're better. And I've never seen any hint of that, or Johnny. Same way. Yeah, nice about it.
We enjoy that week, those 4 days, as much as everybody does. It's of course, after we get de-stressed, because originally we get there like this. But it's just so wonderful to have people that trust us, that do make that investment. And, they come from, one year we had somebody come up from South America. We were like, oh my God, we have someone coming in from England. We've had people come down from Canada. We just are thrilled that they trust us, and we try to we try so hard to give a little bit of a different program every year to make sure that everybody gets something, whether you're brand new, whether you've done 600 books, whatever, that everybody gets something out of it.
Well, I'm happy to be there. So it's a joy having you on the show. And for everybody else, as always, we look forward to seeing you on the wires.
Bye.
Bye-bye.